These are the 11-inch iPad Pro M2 and the M1 iPad Air, and while they look the same visually, offer similar features, and only have a $50 price difference between these particular configurations, there's quite a lot that separates them. I've been using the 5th generation iPad Air since it launched over a year ago. This is the Wi-Fi model with 256 gigs of storage, and more recently I picked up the base 4th gen 11-inch iPad Pro with the M2 and 128 gigs of storage. Because these are so similar in price point, you might wonder which of these to choose from, especially considering iPads are probably the most confusing lineup in terms of pricing and features out of any Apple products. So I wanted to directly compare these two devices and figure out when it makes sense to grab one over the other. A lot of that will depend on how you use these devices, so today I'm diving into my use with both of these iPads and going over what's the same, what's different, and if it really matters. So if you're looking to pick either of these up, or you're wondering if spending more on the Pro is worth it, or are you just here to be entertained, stick around and let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. In the last couple of years, the difference between the Pro iPads and the models below them, and frankly all iPads, has gotten less and less. It wasn't that long ago that the disparity between the iPad Air and the Pro was night and day, not only in performance, but they looked different, had different camera systems and displays. And now looking at what's inside these devices and putting them side by side, the line that separates these has blurred quite a bit. When it comes to these two, the newest 11-inch iPad Pro and the iPad Air, visually they're almost indistinguishable from each other except for the camera bump on the back. The same form factor and dimensions, both have a single USB-C port at the bottom, and I'd say they're the most alike out of any two Apple products. In fact, most cases or folios that you'll find will actually work with either of these models, but I would argue that the Air does have better color options. On the Air, you can choose from silver, starlight, pink, purple, and blue. I like most of these quite a bit because they're subtle and not as in your face as on the regular iPad. And on the iPad Pro, you just have regular old silver and space gray, because apparently anything outside of shades of gray are extremely unprofessional. The colors that I have here today are Starlight on the Air 5 and Space Gray on the iPad Pro. The one thing that I will say about these is the Pro does collect a little more dust around the camera bump because of the difference in the glossy material. Outside of that, when it comes to the design, the Pro is just a touch thinner than the Air, coming in at 5.9mm versus 6.1 on the Air. Technically a hair thinner, but nothing you can actually notice when you're eyeballing it. The display in the Pro is a fraction larger than the Air at 11 inches versus 10.9, with the bezels being smaller on the Pro, and that's not realistically going to make any difference in terms of viewport size. They both have laminated screens with anti-reflective coatings. Both have IPS panels with a density of 264 pixels per inch, but there are some differences there. The iPad Pro screen has 600 nits peak brightness where the Air comes in at 500. I found it very hard to notice any difference there. Even side by side, it can be tough to make any distinction between the two. The color is about the same. You have relatively the same contrast and black levels. The blacks aren't going to get as dark as on the XDR mini LED displays that are in the MacBook Pros or the 12.9-inch iPad Pros, but for IPS panels, they both have outstanding contrast ratios. Usually with an IPS panel, around 1200 to 1 is outstanding, and these are both around 1400 to 1, so great for this type of panel. Everything looks very sharp with great color representation in both light and dark scenes. These are both P3 wide color gamut displays, and I'd say that most folks should generally be happy with either of them in that sense. Up to this point, they seem very much the same, but the biggest difference between these displays is that the Pro offers ProMotion where the Air does not, meaning the Pro can go all the way up to a 120Hz refresh rate where the Air tops out at 60, making everything feel a little bit smoother on the Pro. I do notice this mostly while scrolling, gaming, or watching content. The ProMotion display has a variable refresh rate, meaning it can fluctuate anywhere between 24 and 120Hz. So if you're watching content, it does have the ability to match the frame rate, so it can be a bit nicer visually. The speakers in the Pro also make a world of difference in watching content or playing music, with it having a 4-speaker sound system versus the dual landscape speakers in the Air. Everything is just a lot more full sounding on the Pro, and it will adjust the sound based on the orientation that you've got it in. What I mean by that is whether you've got this in landscape or portrait mode, the speakers are still going to fire from the left and right side, where on most devices like this, they'll fire correctly in one orientation, but when you switch it, the left and right channels will turn into top and bottom, so that's a great little feature. The Air does sound good, but it's just not on the same level with audio quality. It's still a fantastic machine for watching content and listening to audio, I don't think that you're going to be disappointed at all if you're consuming a lot of media on it, but I just wanted to make that distinction. Coming back to the ProMotion for a second, unlike a lot of displays where you're mostly looking at higher refresh rates to improve the smoothness or movement in your picture, this can also make a pretty big difference when you're using the Apple Pencil. Both of these use the same second generation pencil, they clip onto the same spot to charge, but because of the higher refresh rate on the Pro, the drawing experience does feel a lot more fluid on it versus the Air, as it does respond a touch faster. If you're using the pencil a lot, especially for work, say if you're a graphic designer, that's something that you may want to consider. If it's just for note-taking or casual use, it's really not a make or break factor, and people who aren't using their pencil every day likely won't really notice it. The Pro does have one other feature called Apple Pencil Hover, where around 12 millimeters away from the screen, it will activate different functionality. In some apps, you might see your pencil cursor show up on the screen or preview lines before they're committed to an artboard, which can be really handy for some designers or design teams, and it just opens up the potential to do more with the pencil. Because the Apple Pencil does snap into place in the same spot on both iPads, and the smart connector on the back is in the same place, unlike the iPad 10, like I said earlier, you can use most cases and keyboard combos between these as well. If you take a quick look around the interwebs, you can see that a lot of the time these accessories are interchangeable between the two. The only thing that you have to watch out for is that camera bump, like on this Logitech Combo Touch that I have here, where there are two distinct models. If I was going to pick up a case for either of these, I really like the SnapFloat Folio by Moft. This isn't a sponsored post or anything. I just really like how versatile this is and all the different stand modes that I can put it in. I'll link it in the description below, along with everything else that I mentioned in this video. That camera bump is obviously different for a reason. On the Pro, you've got an extra lens on the back, which is a 10 megapixel ultra wide, with the main lens being pretty much the same on the Air and the Pro at 12 megapixels. That ultra wide takes alright photos, and the main sensor photos between these are almost indistinguishable. I won't comment too much on these cameras because I don't think there's a whole lot of people buying iPads for their rear cameras. A few things I will say: you can record in ProRes on the iPad Pro if you desire, where on the Air you cannot. I'm not sure who is doing that, but it's there if you want it. You're able to take portrait images on the Pro as well, where again, that option doesn't exist on the Air. The front-facing cameras are both 12 megapixel ultra wides, and chances are these would be the ones that you'd use the most for FaceTime and video meetings. Just to give you an idea of what each is like, I've recorded a short clip on both models. So this is what the iPad Pro looks like and sounds like on the front-facing camera. I've got it sitting right in front of me and just off to the right so that I remain centered, because that camera is on the left-hand side of the screen. If I actually center out the iPad, you can see I look a little bit weird. I'm off to the side, so I like to just move that to the right so I remain centered. But this is what it looks like and sounds like. Everything's being recorded on those internal mics on the iPad Pro. Now let's move over to the Air and see what that looks like and sounds like. So this is on the iPad Air. Again, this is in landscape mode. So I've got the iPad sitting off to the right just a little bit so I can remain centered in the frame. Otherwise, again, it's going to be off to the left a little bit if I actually have the iPad sitting in the middle, which can be pretty awkward. And also, everything is being recorded on the internal mics on the iPad Air. So this is what it looks like and sounds like. As you can see, the video isn't that much different, but the sound and the microphones in the Pro, in my opinion, are much better. The Air contains 2 internal mics, which don't sound too bad, but the Pro has 5 mics, which Apple says are studio quality. They're definitely a lot more full sounding on the Pro, where the Air is a little bit more flat and picks up a lot of my breath. So if you're on video calls a lot on your iPad, that may be something that you want to consider. Outside that, there's one other thing on the iPad Pro that the Air doesn't have on this front-facing camera, which is something called True Depth. This is the same thing that iPhones use, where infrared sensors are combined with depth analysis on your front-facing camera, enabling Face ID. The M2 iPad Pro uses Face ID as its only biometric unlocking method, where the iPad Pro only uses fingerprints. I'd say there's no real advantage to either, and it's more about which one that you prefer using. They both work incredibly well, and I haven't had any trouble with either. When it comes to actual performance on these machines, again, they're both quite impressive. On the iPad Pro, you've got an M2 chip in here with an 8-core CPU and 10-core GPU, so same as what's in the M2 Max, while the 5th Gen Air has an M1 with an 8-core CPU and an 8-core GPU. Both of these particular models have 8 gigs of RAM and have more than enough power for almost every task. If you're just doing ordinary tasks like checking email, browsing the web, or streaming content, you're likely not going to notice any difference between these. In fact, for that stuff, you could probably just get away with a regular iPad that's cheaper than both of these models. Having an M-series chip in an iPad is overkill most of the time, but both of these are going to be able to do almost anything possible within the bounds of iPadOS. In CPU benchmarks, you'll see the Pro pull ahead just a little, specifically with multi-core performance. but again, there's very few instances where you'll see that performance in the real world. On the GPU side with gaming, the M2 iPad Pro does start to pull ahead a little bit, and you could make the case that you'd likely notice that more for gaming and resource-heavy creative workflows. Having said that, most of the games that you're going to play in the iPad are going to be mobile games, so they're going to run great on both devices. Even the regular iPad 10 is fine most of the time, to be honest, but the iPad Pro does have better overall frame rates. On 3D Mark wildlife benchmarks, it averages about 10 more frames per second, and that combined with the ProMotion display and improved audio does lend itself to a bit nicer gaming experience. Speaking to that resource-heavy creative work, both hold their own really well with any kind of photo editing that I've tried. Regardless of how many layers I have or what I'm working on, I've never felt any slowness on either, but with video editing, that's a little bit different story. As far as sheer processing power goes, both of these can work on a 4K timeline. That's not an issue at all, but the biggest issue that I've run up against has to do with storage, but not in the way that you might think. This iPad Pro only has 128 gigs of storage, which you'd think would severely cripple it in terms of working with large video files compared to this Air, which has 256 gigs, but that's actually not the case, but rather has everything to do with the USB-C ports on these. If you're working on pretty much any 4K project longer than 10 or 15 minutes, chances are either of these options aren't gonna cut it, and you'll need some kind of external storage to support your workflow. The Air is limited to a 10 gigabit transfer speed on that port, where on the Pro I get full Thunderbolt or USB 4, giving me 40 gigabits per second, which is much faster. That means I can hook up my external Thunderbolt SSD and utilize that storage for all that work, and everything is buttery smooth on the M2 iPad Pro, where at a lesser speed on the M1 Air, while it is still usable, it can be a little laggy at times. Storage is something that's going to be highly personal, and I know for me, outside of the photo and video editing that I do, I don't actually have a ton of stuff on my iPad, but if you're downloading a lot of shows from streaming services or you have a ton of games, that's obviously going to be different for you. That's why I think it's important to note that the Air is limited to just 256 gigs of internal storage at the highest option available from Apple, where the 11-inch Pro, while this one is only 128 gigs, you can go all the way up to 2 terabytes, so you do have a lot more options there. That being said, if you're able to offload some of that storage from the internal drive, which won't always be possible if you're talking about putting apps or games on your iPad, but if it's just files, it's a lot cheaper to buy one of these external drives if you have that option. That USB-C port also makes a huge difference if you'd like to use your iPad as a desktop. Now, this is something that I covered in a video a few weeks ago, but both of these machines will support Stage Manager, which allows you to utilize a USB-C port as a display output for a monitor and extend it out and have it behave more like a desktop or a laptop. I'm not going to get into that too much. If you want to see what that looks like, I'll link my desktop iPad video in the description, but because of the 10 gigabit limitation on the Air, it makes it really hard to use both an external monitor and have it work with external storage at the same time via a USB hub. Because it takes quite a bit of bandwidth to run a monitor and you're splitting the transfer speed between multiple devices, the USB transfer speed slows down considerably, where with the Pro, I can hook up a Thunderbolt hub or dock, connect my 4K monitor, and still have adequate transfer speeds for things like external SSDs. So huge advantage there if you're considering a setup like that. Wireless connectivity is also a touch better on the Pro, with it offering Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3, where the Air is only Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.0. This probably won't affect a ton of folks unless you're using or connected to a Wi-Fi 6E router, but I find that Wi-Fi 6E is about 1 to 200 megabits per second faster in transfer speed, and similarly Bluetooth 5.3 is just a lot more recent with better efficiency, security, and connection quality. In terms of battery life, these are both listed as the same, up to 10 hours if you're surfing the web on Wi-Fi. You're likely not going to get a full 10 hours unless you're really dialing back the brightness on these devices, have low volume, and keep your system usage at a minimum. In my experience, they do last for about 7 to 8 hours screen on time with brightness levels at a reasonable level with a combination of light and resource heavy tasks. I won't do a direct comparison between them because I have been using the Air for a lot longer, and it would just be unfair in that sense with the battery having more cycles, but after using each of these, they do feel very similar in that regard. I think for me, where it makes sense to grab the Pro over the Air is if you feel strongly about one of these areas where there are differences. The most glaring one for me in my own personal use is actually that port speed, but if you're someone who uses the pencil a lot, especially if you're in a professional setting, or maybe you prefer the audio quality for calls, or you just really like the ProMotion display, There's definitely value in choosing the Pro over the Air. That being said, the Air in itself is super powerful. It has a great laminated display, and you get a lot of the same benefits like using the 2nd gen Apple Pencil that you can't use on lesser models. You can get double the storage capacity and still come in at a lower price, and if this is going to be something that you're using more casually, maybe just watching some content, taking notes, the odd FaceTime call, that kind of thing, the Air will work just fine. Like I said, I will drop anything relevant that I mentioned in the description, and I would love to hear from everyone else that has an iPad. What model do you have? What do you love about it? And what are your pain points? Let me know in the comments down below. That's it for me today. I hope you found this video useful or enjoyable. If you did, feel free to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more tech-related content or sing a duet with me using only animal sounds, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.